Human Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Heyman.
Hello and welcome to Heyman Nature. I am so pleased to have as my guest Michael Huemer. Welcome, Michael.
Yo, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm going to read your bio real quick because I'm in love with it. Michael Huemer is a professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He is the author of over 80 articles in epistemology, ethics, political philosophy, and metaphysics, as well as 10 amazing books that you should immediately buy. Well,
Thanks for that endorsement.
Is there anything you want to add to that descriptor?
You can check out my blog, Fake News, on Substack.
Absolutely.
FAKENOUS.
It is spelled uniquely, so I'll provide links in the description here. How long have you been in Boulder, Colorado?
Something like 25 years.
Oh, wow. I went to junior high and high school in Golden, Colorado, so my buddies and I would trek up there to hang out with the hippies, and it was always a great time.
Yeah. They're still there, you know.
So you are a professor of philosophy. How would you describe, well, two questions. How would you describe your political philosophy?
Libertarian anarchism.
All right.
Yeah.
We are united.
That is, so.
We are united in that. Many of my listeners will, but many won't. So would you like to give a quick descriptor or a definition?
Yeah. Well, so I think my take on libertarianism is a little different from most people. So I think so there are three main ideas that get you to libertarian political philosophy, right? So the first is the coercive nature of government. And there's just the realization that nearly everything that the government does involves coercion. When they make a law, it involves a threat of violence against the people who would not obey that command. Okay, and in this context, by coercion, I'm sort of using that more broadly than usual. But let's just say I'm talking about things that most people would regard as violating other people's rights if an individual did it to another individual. Okay, and second principle is, well, there's a moral presumption against coercion. Now, I'm not saying that coercion is always wrong. There could be circumstances that justify you in coercing another person, but I'm saying that it's wrong unless you have a good reason for it. Okay. And I don't have a complete list of what all the good reasons are. Okay. But I basically, I have intuitions about it that basically match what you call common sense morality. Right. So just, sort of like use our moral common sense. And when you think about the conditions in which it would be justified, just think about an ordinary person doing a thing to another person. So, so you can use coercion to defend yourself from rights violations. You could use coercion with consent. Like if you're in a boxing match, you can punch the other person in the face. Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. And then the third principle is skepticism of authority. And what I mean by this is roughly that libertarians think that the government should be subject to the same moral principles as everyone else. Okay, now, if you talk to most libertarians, they spend almost all of their time talking about the first two principles. And I think that, and also like people criticizing libertarianism will normally talk about those. And so like they might have this argument about, oh, are rights absolute? Do we only have negative rights or do we have positive rights? And, are your negative rights absolute and whatever? But in fact, I think that that's a mistake and, kind of a red herring, because actually the disagreement between libertarians and everyone else is not about either of the first two principles. Like everyone agrees that there's a presumption against coercion. And pretty much everyone agrees that government is coercive. And where they disagree is that most people think the state has this thing called authority. And authority is a hypothesized moral property that would explain why you're entitled to do things that the other agents that don't have authority are not entitled to do, right? That the state has like they're sort of above the rest of us.
Yeah, I really want to underscore that distinction. I've read almost every primer or deeper understanding explanation of libertarianism that there is. And when your book was recommended to me, I was really impressed with it. I mean, a lot of the arguments that are in there are similar. Yep, there we go. The problem of political authority. It's great, folks. I am not kidding. But what was interesting was that part you just mentioned, just attacking the justification for authority that so many people think is so intrinsic, and you hardly ever get that aspect.
Yeah.
Because instead the authors or theorists will try and build up something, from a natural rights perspective. And they'll talk about how important liberty is for human flourishing and how fair it is, but very rarely will they attack it the way you just did, which is to deny the normal justifications for political authority that most supporters of the state just assume. So yeah, that was great.
Yeah, and so what happens is, like, almost everyone just sort of assumes that the state has authority, but almost nobody knows why. And like, so if you raise the issue, like it's not commonly talked about, but if you raise the issue, like, it's easy to get people to see what the problem is. Why do these 535 clowns in Washington get to tell everybody else what to do? And everybody can see the point of that, and almost nobody has a good answer to it, right? So, like, sometimes they'll throw out the social contract theory because that's what they were taught in high school in their high school civics course, right? But sort of like, it's fairly easily refuted. And then, like serious political philosophers, most of them don't know why the state has authority. And there's several different theories, but basically I go through like the leading theories that you might come up with and explain why none of them works, right? And so the conclusion is, no, well, actually, there isn't an account of the state's authority because it's just an illusion that we're all subject to. Those are just ordinary people just like us. They just happen to have power. They've gained power, and then they said that they had authority over us.
Yeah, one of my favorite visuals is there's nothing magical about the funny hat or the badge that one human is wearing that gives them authority over the rest of us. It's a great illusion.
Yeah, no, this is like, there's a point in one of Richard Feynman's books where he's relating that he was talking to his father back when he was a kid, and the Pope goes by, and like the kid Feynman is wondering what's so special about this person, and the father said it's all about the hat. He's got a really big hat.
Yeah, that's a good answer for a child and for the rest of us, I think. So yeah, the problem of political authority has two basic parts, if I recall correctly. One is knocking down the normal justifications for state authority. And then you also talk about transitioning from the ostensible democracy we live under, or something like it, towards a situation of political anarchy, which in my view is where humanity, if we are going to survive as a species and not blow each other up, we are going to eventually end up at all our institutions and associations being voluntary in nature. Not, obviously we'll have governance because we want it, but we won't have a monopolistic territorial monopoly on what we call the state right now. So you talk about the transition, and I thought that was really interesting. If you want to go through that a little bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, most people don't know what anarchism is. So most people think anarchism is a theory that everybody should just do anything they want at any time. There should just be total chaos. But that's not actually that's not the anarcho-capitalist or libertarian anarchist vision, right? The libertarian anarchist view is, well, so there are some important functions that the state is doing for us. And so we're not saying those things shouldn't be done. We're saying they could be privatized. So in particular, protection, like protection from murderers, rapists, thieves, and so on, okay, that could be privatized. And so, it matters how we make the transition, right? So if the government just all resigned tomorrow with no preparation, then it would be chaos. And then well, first thing that would happen is there would be like riots and whatever, and people would be looting and stuff like that. And then the next thing that would happen would be a bunch of people would say, we need to start a new government, and they would do it. Okay. So it matters how you make the transition, right? And so what I imagine is we could make the transition gradually by the government outsourcing its responsibilities, right? So like the government could start hiring private security guard companies to patrol areas instead of their own police department, which, by the way, has happened in some places. There are some places where like a city government will actually hire a security guard because it's cheaper than having their own police.
Yeah, that's right.
And so you could imagine this expanding to a point where perhaps eventually, why couldn't this happen? They were all security guards. And, you know, why would there need to be a special government police force at all? Right. And then the next thing is, what about the court system? And there are actually some cases where the court system's duties have been outsourced to private arbitration firms, right? So, you know, if you have a dispute with somebody, you can go to arbitration if the other party agrees. Now, you know, if the other party doesn't agree, then they can just make you go to the government court. Okay, but a lot of business disputes will be resolved in this way, disputes over contracts between two businesses, because it's cheaper and it's faster and it's just as good. And so, okay, and so then, and there are some cases where the government courts will actually tell you to go to arbitration.
Sure.
And so we could, like in some automobile insurance disputes, they will tell you to do that. So we could imagine, yes, until eventually every case gets resolved by a private arbitration firm. And then, you know, why do we need government courts? Right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things you learn in economics is that a monopoly provider provides the good at too high a price and at too low a quantity or quality. So why in the world do we rely on the most wretched institution or arrangement in order to provide our most essential goods? It's crazy. And when I argue for political anarchy, you usually get the normal cavalcade of complaints. And in almost every case, they take my situation and compare it against some utopian vision of what government is, rather than the horror show that we're actually living under. And yeah, that's just not a fair comparison. One of the things that struck me in your book is that, again, you weren't relying on a typical natural rights sort of an argument, although there's obviously some of that in there. But you were really relying on a thing I hadn't noticed before or come across before. It was this intuitionism approach. So I want to transition from that book to this other one, which is the second of yours I read, Ethical Intuitionism. So I guess I have a two-part question. First is what would you describe as the major difference between you and your peers in philosophy? And then secondly, you know, what is intuitionism? How long has it been around? What are its rises and falls as far as popular favor? You write about scientism being, you know, a big problem in eclipsing it. So maybe talk about a few of those things.
Oh, the difference between me and the other philosophers, I don't know. I have, like, you know, I have a number of extreme views which are controversial, I guess. So I guess anarchism is an extreme view that's controversial. And you know, mind-body dualism, and I think there's a few more. You know, lately I endorsed reincarnation.
Oh, interesting. On what grounds?
Well, should I give that argument here? Okay, let me just give you the shortest version.
Real brief. Yeah.
Right? Okay. So I argue that time is infinite in both directions, in the past and the future. So if time is infinite, and if persons could only live once in all of time, then the probability that you would be alive now would be 0. But you are alive now, so either time is finite or you could live more than once.
Oh boy, I really don't want to derail you off of intuitionism, but
Yeah.
just briefly, I would, if I were to argue back, I would say we don't have nearly enough data points to say things like probability and, you know, the likelihood of the truth of time. We just don't have access to that kind of knowledge, so maybe we shouldn't be so firm about our opinion. But I do not want to derail you away from intuitionism, because again, in The Problem of Political Authority, I thought it was such a powerful and compelling assortment of arguments. And if you're a system builder, like, I don't know, Descartes, you would imagine, you know, starting from something, a solid foundation, and then piling an edifice of knowledge on top of it. I think that's how most people try and approach philosophy, and I think they're making a category error when they do that. So it was so refreshing to find you just making appeals to our ordinary everyday understanding, our intuition about the world, trying to make sure it's not contradictory. And I found myself thinking, well, yeah, maybe we want something more firm and precise, like geometry or logic, but that's not really what we have as a tool to evaluate these moral claims. What we have is our intuition. I just found that so compelling, and I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so I mean, like, it's common in the sort of libertarian community. It's common to meet people who have this very top-down approach, where like they'll start out by stating some axioms, like, "Oh, you should never initiate force against another human being," right? And then try to deduce libertarianism from that. And basically, like, there's a lot of that sort of thing in the history of philosophy, where somebody starts with some very general abstract principles and then starts deducing consequences, and it almost always goes horribly wrong. And the philosopher will accept whatever ridiculous conclusions follow from that,
Right.
And then like everyone who comes after them will go, "Oh, well, that's ridiculous." So then why should I accept those axioms if they lead to these conclusions? Whatever. The way that human beings actually learn things is generally from the bottom up.
Right.
And you like look at a bunch of particular concrete cases, relatively concrete or relatively specific cases, make the judgments about those, and then you can make a generalization that seems to satisfy the judgment or seems to fit with the judgments about the particular cases. That's how it usually works. And by the way, so a lot of people were inspired by Euclid's Elements for like millennia, and it proceeds in that way of starting with axioms and then deducing a bunch of theorems. But just by the way, that is not how geometry began. So geometry was going on for thousands of years before Euclid wrote his Elements. And it started with people coming up with very specific formulas for specific situations, like calculating areas with specific shapes, things like that. And some of them apparently, or maybe most of them, maybe all of them, were apparently empirically derived, that they would get these area formulas. So some of them are off. They're like good approximations, but they're actually not strictly mathematically correct, which is how you know that they got it empirically and not by deducing it. Okay, so after they'd been doing that for thousands of years, then Euclid comes along and comes up with a system that fits with most of what people discovered. For context, like, there's more time between the start of geometry and Euclid's Elements than there is between Euclid and us.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So anyway, okay, that's a general thing. And then, and like, I'm not saying this on the basis of my a priori assumption. Like, my initial approach to philosophy was the rationalistic one, like starting with the axioms and deducing. And then just over the many years that I've been thinking about philosophy, I just noticed that doesn't go very well. And I noticed that you keep winding up with counterexamples. And then, thinking about specific cases of how people acquire knowledge, I noticed that it's almost always a bottom-up kind of thing.
Yeah, there seems to be a theme that keeps popping up as I get older and wiser and study these things, and that is that top-down is just almost always wrong. It's usually decentralized, bottom-up, more organic it just seems to be the right approach in so many disciplines, and this is one of them, definitely. Can you talk about, well, I definitely want you to touch on scientism, but I'm curious about the typical objections to intuitionism. Oh, and its historical positioning in the philosophy.
Well, people first started articulating what they called intuitionism in the 20th century. I put it that way because, like, whatever, throughout the history of ethics, there were probably people who are kind of like intuitionists, but they didn't call it that. So, okay, but a bunch of 20th century, or, some famous 20th century ethicists, especially British, call themselves ethical intuitionists. And what did this mean? That so first of all, they believe in objective moral truths or objective truths about value, which are irreducible. So you can't explain the nature of value or morality using completely non-evaluative language. And the way that we know about them is through something called ethical intuition. Okay. Now, in philosophy, intuition is, that word doesn't mean exactly what it means in ordinary life. Okay, so in philosophy, intuitions are a type of mental state in which, so you reflect on something intellectually and then something seems to you to be correct. Like you think about the shortest path between any 2 points, it just seems to you like it's a straight line. Okay, and that's what a philosopher would call an intuition. So I don't think people would say that in ordinary life, right?
No, it's important to bring that up, because if you just present your philosophy as, yeah, well, I just pretty much think whatever my gut tells me, that's
Yeah.
probably not going to get picked up on.
So the intuitionists thought that there were some ethical truths that are similar to this, right? That if you just think about it, it's obvious, self-evident maybe. Okay, so like a good example might be, okay, so, happiness is a benefit. Okay, and now, so, you're better off if you're happier. And I'm not sure if that counts as a moral or evaluative claim or not, but we'll get to definitely having moral evaluative claims when we add a few more. Okay, so here's another thing. It seems like it's generally better for people to have benefits rather than harms, unless you have some special reason to the contrary. And it seems like you should prefer things that are better over things that are worse. So you put those three things together, then you get the conclusion that you should prefer for people to have happiness rather than unhappiness. So that last claim is definitely a moral evaluative claim. The three things that I used to get there all seem to me self-evident.
Yeah, I totally agree. So what are the attacks on this this method? What do people say is wrong with it?
The most popular thing for people to say is, "Oh, people could have disagreeing intuitions." Right. See, people can have different intuitions, so now you can't do anything.
Checkmate.
Yeah, and that the people who say that usually don't elaborate on how that's a problem. So if people can have disagreements, then therefore what? Okay, so like. Let's try to fill in some. I don't know. Like maybe the argument is that a method of forming beliefs, it can't be a way of acquiring knowledge if it's not highly reliable. And if people go disagree, then it's not highly reliable. Okay, now maybe maybe the claim is, well, they sometimes disagree, or maybe the claim is just like there's too much disagreement. Okay, if the complaint is just, oh well, people sometimes disagree. Well, people sometimes disagree about anything. And so it's going to result that like this is going to refute too much. This is going to refute certainly any way of acquiring philosophical beliefs, right? And so like whatever this person's own philosophy is going to be refuted because people are going to disagree with that, right? And however that person arrived at their philosophy, there are going to be people disagreeing with that. Okay, but maybe the claim is, no, it's not just that if there's some disagreement, but it's just that there's too much disagreement. Because, there are disagreements about descriptive facts as well. And, like when people try to apply the scientific method, scientists disagree about things. So, and it's not because, one of them is being scientific and the other one's being unscientific or whatever. It's just...
Well, yeah, it reminds me, like when people complain that anarchism is, problematic in some way. Again, they're comparing it to some purple unicorn. And this seems like sort of the same mental problem. They're taking a method of acquiring moral truths that has problems and comparing it to a fiction, to a unicorn, as if your pseudoscientific methodology isn't fraught with problems and still results in disagreement. And guess what? Before Michael Huemer came along, you guys didn't agree about anything.
Yeah, good point, right? Like there is no alternative philosophy about ethics that results in agreement. Like if there was one, we would have used it by now and we would have resolved all the ethical questions. All right, but so...
Oh, I'm so tempted to go off on on tangents because I do like system building. I do think the non-aggression principle is a good one, and I like applying it to specific contexts and seeing what sort of libertarian, property rights judgments might come out in a judicial framework that was based on that. I think that's valuable. And I also think that, axioms like Ludwig von Mises's human action axiom is useful. You can actually spin out a whole economic theory, structure out of that. So it's not like I don't want to. It's not like I want to abandon that tool in our toolkit. I just think people rely on it way too much and assume it has some sort of omniscience that's just not the case. When at the end of the day, all we really have is what we think about things, and try and keeping that consistent. And so, yeah, I like that book. I was blown away by it. I didn't think I was going to like it, but I really do. What do you think, if you had to put percentages on it in the realm of the cadre of philosophers and people who think about things this way, uh, who's winning and by how much? Is intuitionism rule the day, or is it just this minor fringe thing?
Oh yeah, well, so I started to mention that it was popular among like British ethicists in the early 20th century. It lost favor by mid-century, and there was like this rise of logical positivism, which
Right.
I often refer to as illogical positivism.
Right.
Anyway, okay, so they didn't like it because they didn't like intuition. They thought that there's no a priori knowledge, and then it sort of started to make a comeback around around 2000 or something like that. So there've been a few other prominent intuitionists. There's a survey of philosophers' opinions called the Phil Papers Survey, which you can look up, and you can find out what the majority of philosophers thought about a whole bunch of questions that are being debated. It turns out that moral realism is the plurality view. Okay, so there are more moral realists than anti-realists, and so so moral realism is basically that there's objective moral values. And this was a little bit surprising because if you just look at published works, it appears that there are more things defending anti-realism. Okay, but that's probably just because if you reject morality, or you have like a sort of revisionary view about morality, then you feel more impetus to talk about it and to write about it. But if you just have something like the common sense view of morality, maybe you don't have to say anything about it.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so it turns out that actually moral realism is pretty popular. I don't know about intuitionism specifically, though. So a bunch of those people might be ethical naturalists, or they might be sort of, you might say, non-denominational realists.
Yeah, I'm terrible with terms. I guess I would have been tempted to look into whatever ethical naturalist is. I would have thought that would be what I am, but I don't know. Maybe I'm not.
Yeah.
I find your intuition-based arguments very compelling, although, as we just said, they're not perfect. And how could they be? We're imperfect creatures. We have to sort of grope towards truth and discover what is in accordance with our nature and the environment we find ourselves in. And that's just not automatic. There's going to be mistakes we make along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, the ethical naturalists are people who think that ethical truths are reducible, so that you could explain the nature of value or rightness or things like that using non-evaluative language.
Oh, I see. I am tempted by that. I know you can't really cross the is-hot gap, but I think if you're not a psychopath, gosh darn it, yes, we can. but I get it. I get I'm wrong about that. I'm just very tempted.
Well, so the reason why we need intuition is that we can't bridge the is-ought gap. You can't deduce an ought from an is, but you can have an intuition about an ought.
Okay, I'll settle for that.
So the ethical naturalists generally reject intuition, and so they try to give some account of how you could know moral truths empirically. Right, and so I think that's all like conceptual confusions, right? Conceptual mistakes. But anyway, there's a big discussion about that.
Yeah. Do you have anything to say about scientism, more than just as an objection to intuitionism?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me like in our increasingly secular age, we seem to be replacing or filling that religion-shaped hole in our hearts with something like scientism.
Yeah.
You hear people referring to, Fauci springs to mind, but almost as some sort of, priest-like figure who's just laying down the knowledge from on high. And, I don't know, it seems sick.
Yeah, this sort of exaggerated respect for science, and specifically the physical and biological sciences, This goes back decades, right? It goes back to the logical positivists, or even maybe David Hume, right? Who at one point suggested that you should go through the library, look at the books, and ask for each book: does it contain experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence, and does it contain mathematical reasoning, and something like that? And if not, then throw it in the flames.
Oh my.
Right, which would have resulted in David Hume's own work being burned.
Right.
But anyway, okay, this goes back decades. It only recently got politicized, like the respect for science, because I think it was totally contingent that it went that way. But it was because during this coronavirus thing. Oh, there's also the global warming thing, right?
Oh yeah.
Because a bunch of scientists were saying global warming is real, and then there were a bunch of skeptics who didn't want to accept that. So, and then like the pro global warming people, they don't want to have to argue about the evidence. So they just want to say,
just
well,
believe us. Just
trust
believe
the
us.
Figures,
Yeah.
right?
And I don't blame them because their evidence is terrible.
Well, so like I'm not in fact competent to evaluate the evidence about climate science. So to me, it sounds reasonable that I should trust the experts.
Well, I'll give you my opinion. Having looked, I'm not an expert either, but the strongest part of their claim is that all else equal, this greenhouse gas should increase temperature. But of course, the trouble is all else is not equal. And these clowns don't even have the slightest idea how clouds work. And they're trying to tell me that this model or these collection of models, because none of them work, are going to tell us something about the future of the temperature on this planet. I'm just not buying it. And oh, by the way, as a guy who created financial models in my past, models aren't science. Francis Bacon isn't going to endorse this. This isn't the scientific method. What are you talking about? And so, yeah, I don't know what's true, but I don't believe the evidence submitted justifies any of these claims, much less the policy prescriptions by which they're going to impoverish us, make some of us starve, make some of us freeze, deny third world countries the access to fossil fuels that would allow them to, come climbing out of the rubble, the jungles. It's criminal.
Well, yeah. So, like we should distinguish different claims, right? The claim that the temperature has gone up. Okay, so I think I find it very plausible that they would know if that was true. So I don't know how they know that exactly, but
I've looked into how they know that. It's a little suspicious.
But that doesn't sound to me like something unknowable and
no, not unknowable. I just don't think we're there yet. Like looking at the tree rings and the ice cores.
Yeah,
and we're getting better with satellite temperature, but we haven't had that for long. And the measurements taken on the ground, there's all sorts of problems with heat island effects, and you have to just bring a whole lot of assumptions into the simple matter of how you take these disparate readings and come up with a temperature from that. It's not like the Earth has a butt with a temperature thermometer sticking out.
Not as simple as somebody had thermometers 200 years ago. But anyway, so so one claim is the Earth has gotten warmer. Then the second claim is that's largely or mostly caused by human activity. Okay, and then the third claim is, and therefore we should do this.
Right, that's the big part.
Or actually, there's an intermediate thing, right? There's maybe the third claim is that is going to cause these effects and will cause this much cost. And then, there's a claim this thing will reduce the problem or something. And this is the thing that we should do out of all of our options, right? That's great. So the climate scientists would have expertise on the first two questions. They don't have expertise on what we should do,
right,
or on what the costs and benefits are going to be. So they could say, they could estimate what the temperature is going to be in the year 2100 AD, but they wouldn't know what the effects of that are going to be. They can't predict how human beings are going to respond, and so they can't really predict what the costs are going to be. All right, and just like these different policy prescriptions, they wouldn't be able to say which policy is best, right?
Yeah, there's a corollary there to the COVID fiasco, because you had these people whose background was epidemiology, and they're coming out making recommendations for how whether we should shut down society or not. Like that's something you learn about in epidemiology school. You know, there are other factors to be considered.
Well, yeah. What would be the effects on the economy?
Yeah.
Well, like an epidemiologist wouldn't know that.
Even on the death rate, you know, if you smash the supply chain and make it so that people can't work, you know, that's going to hurt some people, right? And it's going to even kill some people. Right. So it's interesting that you know, going back to scientism, you have these people. It looks like a religion to me. They're making appeals to the scientificness of their opinions, but it's all just window dressing. It looks like to me.
Right. And by the way, like, that's unscientific.
Right.
Right. Because the scientific method is not listen to what other people say.
I have a whole bunch of more questions for you, but I'm going to save those for the bonus subscriber only portion of our show, except for one from my partner in this podcast, Tyrone, the hobo porcupine. Don't ask me why he calls himself that. But he asked me specifically to ask you, do you have any thoughts about Aristotle's prime mover or unmoved mover argument?
Well, I guess, but I was like, I guess my general thought is this is not one of the best arguments for the existence of God.
I tend to agree.
Like there are better versions of the cosmological argument. So like when I cover the cosmological argument in class, I just wouldn't do that one. And I would do like Samuel Clarke's version, and I would do the Kalam cosmological argument because they're more natural. They're sort of more intuitive, students could relate to more easily, right? So like the idea that, okay, well, something had to start all motion. I don't know. Like, I don't think that somebody would say this in modern physics. And there had to be an unmoving thing that started the motion. All right.
How would you handle a precocious student who would raise his hand and say, you know, all these people who insist there's a God and all these people who insist on the way all of cosmology works, like there must be a prime mover or something like that. Don't you think that's just Hayek would call that the pretense of knowledge? Shouldn't we be a little bit more comfortable saying, you know, I just don't know. These are all interesting questions. We have a whole bunch of hypotheses, but maybe we shouldn't be too certain about any of them.
Yeah, well, we shouldn't be certain that, right? That's one thing that we can be sure of.
There you go.
Okay, so like the broader question is, well, how did the universe begin?
Right.
And just like, okay, so we talked to the astrophysicist. It turns out that in 14 billion BC there was a Big Bang. So there's a huge amount of mass energy concentrated in a tiny area, and it was moving outward. And that's the first thing that ever happened that we know of. Right? Okay, and like, that can't be the whole story.
Clearly not.
Like,
and also, I would take that with a grain of salt. I mean, we have reasons to think that that's what happened.
Yeah.
But even there, it's not. I mean, we have to enter this thing with some humility, I think.
No, well, yeah, that's right. So like, I'm not 100% certain that that's what happened, but that's what it looks like. Okay, but why did that happen? Like, right. Surely the truth isn't that just happened for no reason. It was just like that for no reason.
And if that is the answer, well, then the creationists have a pretty solid or intuitive point. If that's your explanation, well, that sounds like God to me, right?
Well, yeah. So that would be an explanation of why the Big Bang happened, right? Maybe God did it because he wanted there to be this stuff around us.
It is great stuff.
Now, so I think that's not a dumb thing to think, but I don't think it's a very good theory. And like, my problem with God as an explanation is sort of that it explains too much.
Right.
So it's sort of like anything that happened, you could say, oh, maybe God did that.
So when I'm taking this back to Tyrone, your answer would be you have a better version of the prime mover argument. And I'm sorry, remind me again, what exactly would that be?
Okay, so there's the version of the cosmological argument that they call the Kalam cosmological argument. I don't know why it's called that, but anyway. So it starts by saying, well, anything that has a beginning in time has to have a cause.
I see.
And the universe has a beginning in time, so the universe must have a cause. And then you start thinking, what could the cause of the universe be? And you try to argue that the most plausible answer that we can come up with is that it was like a supernatural being. Why do we think the universe had a beginning in time? And then the people usually try to give this argument that you can't have a completed infinity, or you can't have an actual infinity. And if the universe didn't have a beginning, then its history would be a completed actual infinity, right? And that's where most atheists reject the argument. That most atheists would say, no, the universe could just go back forever.
Or we don't know. There's something about the human animal that just wants to insist it knows something for certain.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So like, when people come up with explanations for the universe, right? Really, the dominant answer is something that nobody's thought of yet, right? Like,
right, yeah,
that's
exactly.
That's where you should place your money if you had to.
Absolutely, I am a betting man, and yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, again, I have a whole bunch more interesting questions, but for that, you should go to heymannature.substack.com and become a supporting member. But before we let you go from this half of the conversation or portion, how would you advise people go on their interwebs to see more of you, Michael?
Yeah, so go to my Substack, Fake News, FAKENOUS. If you just search for that, you'll probably find it. But fakenews.substack.com. I also have a website, owl232.net.
The links to both of those will be in the description. Also, those 3 books that we mentioned. Is there anything else that you've written that you're particularly proud of that you want to plug?
I don't know. You should go to my Amazon author page because there's like 10 books that I've written.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea.
Wait. I have this introduction to philosophy.
It looks like a good one. You just magicked out of that obviously real bookshelf.
And I even took this cover photo. See, it's very nice.
That is very nice. How did you come upon the problem of political authority photo, which is so cool, with this chessboard king that we should be suspicious of?
So the publisher, Macmillan, said that I should go to some site that has like a whole bunch of photos, and I should look for a photo on that site.
That's how
I looked for chess pieces because I thought like the king and the pawns are a good metaphor for authority.
It certainly is. Well, thanks again, Michael. I really appreciate you taking the time out for me, and I hope you folks have enjoyed this. We'll see you next time at Heyman Nature.
All right. Thanks for having me.
You bet.